Hi. So, to those of you who are tuning in and maybe not sure who I am, my name is Tara Lehman. I'm the Executive Director with the Portugal Cove St. Philip's Chamber of Commerce. And I'm joined here today with Julie and Alexander from the town of PCSP. We did an event earlier today called Your Town and You, which I'll let them launch into what that is all about, give you a description of that in just a moment. But we had, it was a great event earlier today. And just for the sake of those who couldn't make it with us this afternoon, we wanted to run the recording of it for you here again this evening. And you'll also see it on Facebook Live, and it's also going to go up on our website, chamberpcsp.ca. So I'll let Julie and Alexander do a introduction to you here now so you know what to expect out of the video. Welcome.
Thank you for having us. So my name is Julie Pomeroy. I am the Heritage and Environment Coordinator with the Town of Portugal Cove St. Philip's. Today I will be doing a short presentation on composting and introducing a new pilot project that we are going to be doing with the community this year.
Fantastic.
Hello, my name is Alexander Templeman. I'm the Climate Change Coordinator here at Portugal Cove St. Philip's. This afternoon I did a relatively short presentation on a bit of climate science, a background of climate change, and then some tips of what we're doing as a town to reduce our emissions and little tips that what can you do as a resident or a business to reduce your own emissions.
All right, and it was a wonderful presentation, great participation, and so I thank you for doing that, and I'm glad we can now replay this for those tuning in with us this evening and beyond. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.
So as I said, my name is Alexander Templeman. I'm the Climate Change Coordinator, and for this presentation today, first I'm going to start off with a brief overview of climate change and some climate change science. Should take about 10 minutes or so. Then we're going to do an outline of the Partners for Climate Protection program and our progress through that. Next will be a summary of our greenhouse gas inventories and our reduction targets. And then to clue up, we're just going to do an outline of our current mitigation actions and then some tips to reduce emissions in our town. So before I begin, just a little context to get everyone on the same page. This picture is known as Earth Rising. It was taken December 24th, 1968. This is the first picture of Earth from the moon's orbit. And I think it does a really good example of showing, at the end of the day, that's us. That's all we got. That's our home. That is everyone you know, everyone you've ever known, anyone you love, everyone you ever will love, anyone that's ever been, maybe everyone that's ever will be, is that little blue dot there. That's all we got. Beautiful oceans, land masses, and our atmosphere made of nitrogen, oxygen, and some other gases that I'm sure will not come up later. So what is climate change? As you'd imagine, climate change is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's the changing of our climate. Climate meaning the average conditions of an area, such as temperature and rainfall over a long period of time. There's a lot of stuff that affects the Earth's climate. However, when we talk about climate change, we usually mean anthropogenic climate change, meaning climate change that we as the human species are responsible for. And mostly the biggest contributing factor to that, as you probably know, is our emission of greenhouse gases, which interrupt the natural greenhouse effect of our planet, trapping more heat and thus warming the planet more than it's ever been before. So just we're on the same page, here's a nice little infographic of the difference between weather and climate change. Weather takes a span over very short periods of time, days, months, even shorter, as we know in Newfoundland. There's natural climate variability, things that affect the climate over years or decades, things like El Nino and other kind of interesting quirks of our atmosphere and ocean interaction. And then we have actual climate change, global warming, sea level rise, changes in average climate temperatures. These are things that happen over decades or centuries. So how do we know this is even happening? You hear a lot about it. How do we know it's happening? Well, in the most straightforward sense, it's because we've been measuring it. Here's a graph of the global mean surface temperature. It's going back to about 1880. And you can clearly see there's an upward trajectory. The Earth has been warming the past 100 years or so. But you may ask, hasn't the climate changed before? And you'd be right, the climate has changed many times in the past. Here is temperature anomaly data going back as far as 800,000 years ago. We get this stuff from ice core data in the Arctic, which is pretty cool. So as you can see, there's many ups and downs along the way. The biggest factor that controls these ups and downs is actually the relative position of the Earth to the sun. These are called Milankovitch cycles. So over the course of tens or hundreds of thousands of years, as the Earth revolves around the sun, there'll be subtle changes in the eccentricity, the tilt, and the precession of the Earth. Basically, how far away and the angle that the Earth is relative to the sun. The closer and more extreme angle to the sun, the more solar radiation we get, which highly affects our climate and temperature, as you can imagine. So that's all well and good. We've seen these natural changes in the past. We've seen these glacial and interglacial periods, cold and hot periods throughout the time. So you can see here, glacial, interglacial, glacial, interglacial. So what's different about this time? What's all the big hubbub this time? Just to go back, here is the warming over the past 100 years or so. Well, the big difference this time is time. In the past, we saw a warming of about 0.11 degrees over a 100-year time span. Now we're looking at a 1.1 degree warming over a 100 years time span. We're talking 10 times the warming in the same period of time. So why is that? Well, in order to answer that, let's talk about CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So in front of you is a graph of the CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere over the same time period, about 800,000 years ago. Again, this comes from ice core data. And there's two things I'd like you to take away from this graph. Number one being, we're way higher than we've ever been. Historic levels teeter out at about 300 parts per million. We are over 4 in our current state. And not only that, I'd like you to look at the shape and the pattern of the graph itself. Does that look familiar to anybody? As a hint, here's the temperature graph again. And just to really bring it home, here's both of them on top of each other. So quite a lot of correlation there. If I was a detective, I may call that a smoking gun, but we're all good scientists here. We know correlation does not necessarily equal causation. So let's dive a bit deeper into the properties of CO2 and greenhouse gases in general. So I'm going to try to make this a little quick physics lesson. You may remember hearing in school about the electromagnetic spectrum. Electromagnetic radiation has different types based on its wavelength, everything from ultraviolet over to microwave radiation. Another quirk of physics is everything with a temperature emits radiation of some kind. The peak of that radiation spectrum, the wavelength, is determined by the temperature. That's known as Wien's law. So in kind of layman's terms, basically, the type of radiation that comes in from the sun is over here in the visible spectrum, which is very good. It'd be very dark if it wasn't. And the radiation being absorbed and then re-emitted by the Earth is over here in the infrared spectrum. Now, below these peaks here are several types of greenhouse gases. We got things like ozone, CO2, even water vapor. And then their kind of absorption percentages, what part of the spectrum do they like? You can look at it that way. What part of the spectrum do they like to absorb? And you can see interesting quirks here, like ozone loves ultraviolet radiation. So if you've ever heard about the ozone protecting us from UV radiation, that's how that works. And if you look at the infrared side of things, where the Earth is emitting, these greenhouse gases love this type of spectrum. The visible side that gets into the Earth is not too affected, so the heat can get in, but a lot of the heat trying to get out is actually captured. And this is known as the greenhouse effect. Here's a nice little infographic. Sun comes down, some of the heat gets bounced back, some of it is absorbed and re-radiated, or it's absorbed by the atmosphere and then re-radiated back out in all directions, including back down to Earth, causing more warming. If you want to watch that again, energy in, some gets bounced back, gets reabsorbed as heat and re-radiated. There it's taken by the atmosphere and reabsorbed and then reflected in all directions. So you're probably familiar with that property of CO2. One you may not be is the solubility of carbon dioxide in water. Basically, this graph shows how much CO2 can you dissolve in water given the temperature of said water. The shape of this graph, you can see a downward trajectory here. Basically, the hotter the water is, the less CO2 it can hold. You may have noticed this on a warm can of soda versus a cold can. A warm can will fizz way more. That is exactly the reason why. And if we apply this to the largest source of water on our planet, the oceans, we can see that the warmer our oceans get, the less CO2 they can hold, and they'll actually start to release that back out. So we have this relationship of more raising temperatures, releasing more CO2, and in turn, more CO2 capturing more heat, raising temperatures. In science, we call that a positive feedback loop. One empowers the other and vice versa. So if you're putting all that together, the properties of greenhouse gases and CO2 and the various cycles we've seen in the past, that's how we come up with this correlation between temperature and CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. And that is a good thing. I must stress that the greenhouse gas effect as is great. We would be a giant ice ball without it, so good thing for that. And the Earth, for the most part, is very good at keeping all this in balance. I'm sure you remember the carbon cycle from when you were in grade school. You know, there's natural sources of carbon getting released, stuff like decomposition and animal respiration. And then there's ways that carbon gets sequestered and used again by things like photosynthesis, plants using that for respiration. And that all works really harmoniously and nicely together. The problem is we've been kind of messing with it by putting more and more of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and disrupting this natural cycle and balance. And to the point where we're much higher than we've ever seen in any kind of historical record. So that's where we are at the moment. But as I said, there's many natural sources of carbon. You may be wondering, are you sure that carbon came from us? You know, got to make sure. So in order to do that, you knew it was coming and to talk about climate change. Let's talk about fossil fuels. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean those. I meant fossil fuels. So what are fossil fuels? Fossil fuels include fuels such as coal, petroleum, natural gas, oil, tar sands. I'm sure you've heard a lot of these. They're actually made up of fossilized buried remains of plants and animals that lived millions of years ago. This fuel is combustible in air. It releases heat in the process. That's how we move and heat things with it. Living matter has a lot of carbon. We're all carbon-based life, if you heard that term. So this process of burning living stuff also releases a ton of CO2. Fossil fuels also contain a lot of carbon-12 and very little of carbon-13 and 14 due to carbon isotope properties. And if you're wondering what that means, let's talk about it for a second. So carbon has three naturally occurring isotopes: carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. The number refers to the atomic mass of the atom. Of these, carbon-12 and 13 are stable, meaning they're not going to radioactively decay. They're good to go. If you had a friend, you'd want it to be 12 or 13. Now, carbon-14 is not stable and is created naturally from cosmic radiation way up in the atmosphere, basically through this process here. Cosmic radiation bombards gases in the atmosphere. A neutron whacks off a proton and it sends, a neutron hits with a nitrogen atom. That nitrogen atoms then turn into a carbon-14 atom and a proton. And that happens due to cosmic radiation high up in the atmosphere. And now living organisms prefer, and I use that term loosely, to use C12 over C13. If you look at the composition of living matter, things like the process of like photosynthesis and stuff, it's easier for living things to use 12 over 13. Now, if you apply these properties to fossil fuels, as we mentioned earlier, it's made of living things, so that should have way more 12 than 13. And the 14 is only made way up in the atmosphere, right? So this stuff's been buried underground for millions of years, so none of that is happening up there. So fossil fuels have a ton of carbon-12. So if we looked at the composition of the carbon that's in the atmosphere, that's more than it's ever been, we should expect if this carbon is made of fossil fuels, it should be mostly carbon-12. And that's exactly what we see. Here's some graphs of the percentage concentration of carbon-14 and 13. And you can see a reduction in the amount of 14 and 13 here, which means the percentage is mostly carbon-12, which was what we should expect to see with the burning of fossil fuels. And just as a quick side note, if you're wondering why this graph gets kind of crazy around here, this is when we started detonating nuclear bombs on Earth and irradiating our own atmosphere from the bottom up. So way to go us, I guess. So in a sense, we know fossil fuels are contributing, but the fact is most things we do produce greenhouse gas emissions. This is a really nice infographic showing the balance between the two sides. Anytime you power something, grow something, move something, build something, there are some emissions involved. Every time you cut down a tree to build a parking lot, you're taking away the planet's ability to sequester those gases. So In its simplest sense, climate action means reducing the inputs on this side and expanding the sinks on this side. We want to reduce this and help these out to the best of our ability. All right, so we know this is happening, but what effects will this actually have on our planet? Well, there's a lot. Effects on this climate change will be wide-ranging and highly variable depending on location. The Earth's mean annual temperature will continue to rise. There'll be changes in precipitation patterns, more intense and more frequent extreme weather events such as hurricanes, increases risk in flooding. This is changes to the flood risk in zoning areas in your town. More droughts and heat waves, which increases risk of forest fires. There's sea level rise and further warming of our oceans. There's coastal erosion that goes along with that. We could end up with an ice-free Arctic, especially in the summer periods. Disruption of our natural ocean currents, which will only exacerbate the climate change scenario. Changes in growing seasons, increased spread of diseases in pets, a massive disruption of natural ecosystems, not to mention the downstream social, political, and economic impacts that all these will carry. So in a nutshell, climate change is near all-encompassing. There are virtually no aspect of the world and our lives that it won't impact directly or indirectly in some way. So what about here in Portugal Cove St. Phillips? What effect will this have for us? Well, here's a nice infographic about the projected temperature changes we should see. So right now we're at an annual baseline of about 5.3 degrees Celsius. So that's the annual average for temperatures in the year. By mid-century, we should see an increase of about 1.5 degrees and over 3 degrees by the 2080s, by late century. If you want to see that same information displayed over seasons, you can see that every season, especially by the late century, is predicted to get significantly hotter, like a few degrees hotter than it is now. And that's true for the summer, fall, spring, and winter. Looking at the precipitation side, we also see an increase. Here we are at our annual baseline of about 1,325 millimeters of precipitation annually. And by late century, we're going to see another 125 millimeters of rain annually projected. So that's much more precipitation, much more flood risks, and all the things associated with that. Here's the same information broken up by season. Again, you can see every season it's going to be a little wetter and a little warmer. So specifically what that could involve is obviously increased temperatures and precipitation, like I said, which means increased temperatures, increased forest fire risk, increased precipitation, increased risk of flooding. There's also things such as sea level rise and increased storm surges. We're a coastal community, so obviously that's very important to us. Certain projections predict a rise of 1 to 1.2 meters by the turn of this next century, which would obviously increase flooding and coastal erosion. There's also going to be more extreme weather events. I'm sure you all remember Snowmageddon that caused thousands of dollars worth of damage in Portugal Cove, millions throughout the province. And I must stress, while no single weather event can be directly linked to climate change, so I'm not saying Snowmageddon was climate change, it's just the frequency and the likelihood of these events will continue to increase as we continue to add energy into the system through greenhouse gas emissions. So in a easy to remember context, a 100-year storm will become a 25-year storm by mid-century. So that means the worst storm you'd see in 100 years would become a storm you'd see every 25 years. So that's 4 times as likely by mid-century. Now you may be asking, is it too late to stop this? And to answer that, I'll use one of my favorite Simpsons jokes is short answer, yes with an if, long answer, no with a but. And in that context, I would say, yes, we already are seeing the effects of climate change, and we will continue to. And if we don't change our ways, we will see the worst effects of this. But also, no, we can mitigate the effects of climate change, especially the worst effects of climate change. But we need to drastically change the way we do things almost at every level in every sector. And just to really drive that home, here's some temperature projections for Newfoundland and Labrador as a province. There's several different scenarios, but in a nutshell, it's up to us whether we want to end up somewhere around here or somewhere way up here. Those will be based on the actions we take as a province and as a global community as well. So what are we doing about it? Well, in 2019, Port Rico Cove St. Philip's joined the FCM ICLEI Partners for Climate Change Protection Program to develop our climate mitigation plan. And we've actually already completed our climate adaptation plan. Just so everyone's on the same page, adaptation and mitigation are kind of two sides of the same coin. In climate resilience, adaptation means action to manage the risk of climate change itself, adapting to climate change. And mitigation means reducing emissions that cause climate change, mitigating the effects of it in the future. And there, of course, are some overlap between the two of those. So what's the PCP program? The PCP program is the Partners for Climate Change Protection Program. It's a collaboration with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and local governments for sustainability. It's a commitment to climate change mitigation action. And over 400 communities across Canada have already joined the PCP program. It's based on a 5-milestone framework. And to date, we have completed milestone 2 as a town. Here are the milestones I was just speaking of. The first being to create a baseline greenhouse gas inventory and forecasts. The second to be setting emission reduction targets based on those forecasts. The step 3, develop an action plan to reach those targets. Step 4, implement said plan. And then step 5, monitor progress and report results. And currently we're on milestone 3. We're developing our local action plan. So back to milestone 1. The first stage was to create greenhouse gas inventories for the town. The town used 2018 as its baseline year. And the inventories were created for both the corporate operations of the municipality and the community as a whole. Inventories were based on recorded usage as well as model data. And baseline inventories are used to identify where emissions reductions can be made and to measure success of mitigation actions when compared to future inventories. And just a note, all emissions are expressed in tons of CO2 equivalent. There are a myriad of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. This is a nice way of kind of equating them to a universal standardized unit. The way it works is the different gases have different global warming potentials. Just as a quick example, not to get too deep into this, methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. In a 100-year period, it warms the atmosphere 25 to 30 times more than CO2. So in a 100-year time span, 1 ton of methane is worth 25 to 30 tons of CO2 equivalent. Hope that makes sense. So let's start with our corporate inventory. So our corporate municipal operations for the year 2018 released 514 tons of CO2 equivalent. Here's it broken down by sector and by source. Excuse me. So you can see our emissions are dominated by our transportation sector, heavily dominated, which can then be broken up into diesel and gasoline here. Follow that would be our building infrastructure, which can be split into electricity and oil, followed by waste and lighting. In the sources here, you can see our emissions mostly come from our diesel heavy duty trucks, then by our gasoline powered vehicles. Oil, it comes from one building in our infrastructure that's on oil and gas, oil heating, and then electricity, which will actually see significant reductions in the future. We'll get into a little bit of that in a bit. Moving on to the community inventory. As an entire town for the year 2018, we emitted 53,323 tons of CO2 equivalent. Here's it broken down again by sector and by source. Again, coincidentally, 78% transportation, dominated by transportation. We are a bedroom community, as it's known. Most people commute in and out of the city every day for work, so it's only natural that there'll be a ton of transportation and then a ton of associated emissions with that transportation. We can see it's mostly dominated by gasoline and diesel, and then followed up by stuff like oil heating in homes and electricity. So we got our inventory set, and the next step would be to make our reduction targets and projections. The town based its reduction targets on PCP recommendations. Individual targets have been set for corporate and community inventories, and projections were made for business as usual and hydroelectric scenarios. So business as usual, meaning if we didn't change a thing at all, we just kept doing what we're doing, we would expect our emissions to grow sequentially with the growth rate of the population itself. So 3.36% is the estimated population growth rate for Port Rico Cove St. Philip's from 2018 to 2030. And that's under the target migration scenario provided by the Harris Center at MUN. So the biggest kind of what if, hopefully not an unknown towards all this, is I'm sure you all know that the province of Newfoundland is moving to a hydroelectric infrastructure. I'm sure you're all sick to death of hearing about Muskrat Falls and the Lower Churchill project. But when that does come online, we should see a significant reduction from our electric infrastructure. What that means for the community and the corporate. So the community as a whole should see a reduction about 2.71%, and the corporate about 7.68%. And that comes from reductions in existing electric infrastructure, meaning the electricity that's already in place will be cleaner in the future when it comes from hydroelectric sources. And now finally to our reduction targets themselves. So as a town, we've committed to 6% reduction of baseline emissions by 2030. That will bring us from 53,323 to just over 50,000. And for our corporate section of the municipal operations, we're committed to a 20% reduction of baseline year by 2030. That will bring the corporate operations from 514 tons a year to 412 tons a year. Altogether, we're looking to mitigate about 3,300 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, which is a really great start. So you may be wondering, that's all well and good, but how are you going to get there? Well, the first of our actions, because transportation is such a dominant sector in our emissions, would be our EV infrastructure. The town has applied for funding to expand its electric vehicle infrastructure through FCM. This funding would provide 5 electric vehicles in the corporate fleet, as well as the installation of 4 new charging stations for the town. That'll be 3 level 2 and 1 level 3. Level 3 of the quick fast charging stations, as they're known. This will not only reduce emissions from our corporate fleet from the use of the electric vehicles, but it will also provide opportunities for residents to charge their own vehicles and encourage further adoption of electric vehicles in Portugal Cove St. Phillips. Also to do with the transportation sector is our idling reduction initiative. The town of Portugal Cove St. Phillips is promoted as an anti-idling zone to its residents and employees. However, idling still provides a significant percentage of transportation emissions within the town. So further adoption of these idling reduction practices by citizens and employees will see notable reductions in transportation-related emissions. The next of our actions is composting. I will briefly go over this now because Julie is going to do a bit more of an in-depth presentation of our composting initiative, but very, very briefly, we've expanded the sale of our compost bins to residents this spring after great response from the previous years. The town has acquired 4 large fast-acting composters for installation throughout the town. And composting drastically reduces the amount of methane released from waste material. This is aerobic versus anaerobic decomposition in the presence of oxygen or not. When organic material decomposes in the presence of oxygen, much less bacteria that releases methane gets created, so that's great. So composting will reduce the amount of waste sent to Robin Hood Bay. This will reduce emissions not only from the waste sector, but the transportation sector due to lighten load. And composting also provides great resources for programs such as the community garden and other agricultural projects. So that's a nice bonus. So related to that is our recycling initiative. The town currently offers bi-weekly curbside recycling to its residents. However, a recent waste audit showed this program is underutilized by residents and provides an opportunity for waste reduction within the town. The town is currently looking for ways to increase the usage of the recycling program. And the way that works is, in general, it takes less energy to recycle material than it is to manufacture new material. So when you recycle, you save energy and thus emissions in the process. Next would be our retrofitting initiative. The town is exploring retrofitting options to improve efficiency in its municipal infrastructure. And similar actions can be used by citizens to make their own homes more efficient, saving energy, saving money, and reducing emissions. You know, stuff like smart thermostats, improved insulation. We'll get into a bit more of the tips later. And finally, education. The town will continue to educate employees and residents on climate change and how it affects our community, and provide tips to citizens on ways they can reduce their own carbon emissions, which I'm hoping that I'm doing today. Hopefully you're learning something, and hopefully you take away something good from this. So let's get into the tips. What can we do? What can businesses do? Let's start there. So here's some business actions for climate change. First of all, I'd encourage you to educate yourself and your employees about climate change. It's very difficult to make change about anything if you don't know what it is you're trying to change. Another great way is to kind of follow the guide map we have and create your own greenhouse gas inventory, set your own reduction targets, and then create an action plan to reach those targets. That may sound very daunting, but I assure you it's not as complicated as it seems. And if you need any help with that, please contact me. I would love to be of assistance for that. More concretely, you can do things to optimize your transportation, things like carpooling, no idling, telecommunications, we're on Zoom right now, and electric vehicles in your fleet. I must stress, whenever I give a tip for this presentation, it's when possible, practicable, and within reason. So carpooling, fantastic way to reduce your emissions. We are in a pandemic at the moment, so choose the option that is the most practical at the time. That may be a more viable option in the future. The next thing you could do is reduce waste, avoiding using disposable items when possible, avoiding unnecessary printing, recycle and compost whenever possible. These things will not only reduce the amount of waste and associated emissions, but it also save money on tipping fees to the dump. You can also reduce the energy consumption of your business. Simple things, turning off lights and unplugging appliances when not in use. The use of LED lighting over traditional high pressure sodium. The installation of smart thermostats, or simply turning down the temperature in general. Choosing low carbon options for heating. Unfortunately, oil heating is a high emitter. I know it's financially viable, but things like a heat pump are both financially viable and reduce emissions. So I'd encourage you to explore and see what options are right for you financially and emissions wise. And finally, explore net metering options. Net metering would be the production of your own electricity, usually stuff like solar and wind infrastructure, where you actually give power back to the grid. That is allowed in Newfoundland to a certain extent, and I'd encourage anyone to explore those options. NL Power has more information for you on that, or contact me and I'll be happy to help you out there too. On the inverse of that, I'd like to stress that climate actions can also help your business too. It's not only a one-way street. Green approaches can improve your business. As I mentioned, stuff like net metering can save money and even provide additional income in certain situations. If you're an agricultural business, regenerative farming practices can improve land and crop quality while reducing emissions. Installation of an EV charging station near your business will encourage customers to visit your location while they wait. Even with these fast charging stations, they take upwards of 20 minutes to a half hour. You got to do something while you wait. If one of these is in front of your store, odds are they may pay you a visit. Energy efficient retrofits can save money and be eligible for rebates. I'd encourage anyone to check out Take Charge NL and all their associated rebates. And kind of two sides of the same coin here. Customers are making more informed purchases and may avoid buying products that are detrimental to the environment and contribute to climate change. And also customers will want to support businesses that are environmentally conscious. So little things like, this is a certification you can get by appears on products made by a carbon neutral company. These are the kind of things people are looking for in the products they buy. So something to keep in mind and maybe strive for in the future. So we got into businesses. What about residents? What can we do with citizens? Now you may see a lot of overlap here, but I've actually divided it into three categories. We'll go travel, home, and then food. So let's start with travel tips. Of course, carpooling when practical and able to and safe to. Sharing a ride to work when able to is a great way to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. Stuff like active travel, simply walking or biking, to the store instead of driving, going for a walk instead of a drive, stuff like that. Telecommunication, again, we're on Zoom now. If it saves you a trip to the office, that's great, less emissions. No idling, again, most of the time idling is completely unnecessary. So if you just cut that bad habit out, you'd be saving a tremendous amount of emissions. Even little things like checking your tire pressure. If your tires are actually under pressure, they'll use more fuel than if they were at the proper certified pressure. So good thing to keep in mind. And of course, low carbon vehicles, electric vehicles, hybrids, etc. These things are becoming more viable and accessible to people. The prices are going down and they will continue to go down in the future. So something to keep in mind and see if that's the right option for you. Now, tips for your home. Again, choosing low carbon energy for heating. Oil is one of the higher emitters for home heating. So stuff like electric or a heat pump would be a more viable option from an emission standpoint. Explore other green retrofitting options, improving your insulation in your house, for example. Net metering, again, see if that's a viable option for you. Little things, again, turning down the heating and cooling smart thermostats, using natural light when possible. If it's a bright sunny day and you don't need the light on, then don't turn it on. And then if you need to turn lighting on, using LED bulbs of the traditional high pressure sodium can save a ton of energy and associated emissions. Again, turning off the lights, unplug when not in use. Low flow fixtures save on water and then less energy to move and heat that water. Washing clothes in the cold setting and line drying your clothes can save a ton of energy and emissions. And then the classic refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, the 4 R's. You've probably heard them since grade school. I'll just like to stress that these are written in order of importance. So I would encourage you to, first of all, refuse anything that's unnecessary for you to buy, reduce the amount that you feel is necessary to buy, reuse whenever possible, and then at the end, recycle what is ever be able to. And I would throw composting on that as well. And finally, food tips. We all got to eat, right? So first of all, reducing food waste is one of the main things you can do. About 1/3 of all the food that gets produced globally is wasted. It doesn't end up on a plate, it ends up in the bin. So any associated emissions, any resources, even just the time and energy it went into creating that food, it's kind of all for naught if it ends up in the dumpster. And so just by using the food you have, not wasting it, being maybe a bit more conscious at the grocery store how much you're buying, and especially with perishable foods, you can have a dramatic effect on your reducing your carbon footprint. Next would be composting, which Julie will talk about a bit more, but as I said, reduces a lot of methane emissions associated with decomposition. So while you're reducing your food waste, if you do have any left over, I would encourage you please compost it. And finally, low carbon diets. Every time we grow food, we are creating some kind of emissions associated with that. Not all foods are created equal in an emissions context. For context, here's a graph of different food sources and their emissions per 1,000 kilocalories. So all these will be 1,000 kilocalories, and then how much emissions associated with that. I understand this is always the most kind of controversial point of mitigation that I've encountered, at least in my personal career. I'm not telling you how to eat. I know, I understand food is very personal and has a great deal of cultural significance to people, but I would encourage you, please look at this graph, take in the information, and make of that what you will. So just to clue up, just some takeaway points. The climate is changing. The Earth has already warmed about 1.1 degrees. Climate change will not affect areas equally. I showed some projections for Portugal Cove as a town. Just as some context, Labrador, especially northern Labrador, will be affected much more than we will. It's projected by mid-century, Maine, Labrador will have similar winters to that we do in St. John's right now. So if anyone has an experience with what it's like in northern Labrador, that is a huge transition from the type of winters they're experiencing. So different areas will be affected differently. Also, the intensity of these effects will continue and will continue to increase as we continue to produce greenhouse gas emissions. And nearly everything we do produces greenhouse gas emissions. Change is needed now in every sector at every level. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to listen to me. I really appreciate it. If I can give any more information, please reach out to me, or my email is on the Portugal Cove St. Philip's website under the climate change section. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I think if there's any question answer period, we can leave that to the end. I think what we'll do is let Julie go ahead now, so she can add on to all the wonderful things that Alexander just said for us.
Thank you. Just let me get my screen shared. There we go. Thank you, Alexander, for all of that. That was fantastic information. I'm going to minimize everybody so that I can see my screen a little bit better. So again, I'm the Heritage and Environment Coordinator for the town of Portugal Cove St. Philip's. And thank you, Tara and the Chamber, for having us here today to talk about everything that we're doing. Alexander did a fantastic job of talking about how composting relates to climate change. So as a town, we have committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 6% by the year 2030. And that is for our community emissions. In order to do that, we're going to need the help of our community. So one of our first mitigation action items is composting, and I will be discussing two town composting initiatives. One is our backyard composters and a new community-wide pilot project. So what is composting? Alexander talked about this, but most simply put, composting is when you take all of your organic waste, collect it in a bin, and let it decompose to become soil. So when you think about everything that's going into the landfill in terms of your organic waste, that is literally just being wasted. And it could be turning into something really wonderful and usable. There are many different types of composting bins and binless styles, but the methods and principles are the same. And the soil that is created is nutrient rich and often called humus or black gold. Again, to talk about food waste, about $31 million worth of food is wasted every year in Canada alone. And about 41% of food waste comes from homes. 30% of Newfoundland's waste that ends up in the landfill is organic. Those statistics came from Rethink Waste NL on the MMSB website. So food waste and PCSP, we've determined that about 50% of all solid waste produced is actually organic and biodegradable. We recently conducted a waste audit here in the town, and that showed that nearly a quarter of what we are bringing to Robin Hood Bay is organic. That is the equivalent to about 295 tons of greenhouse gas annually. We do not have any sort of provincial projects in terms for composting. So until something like that comes to be, it ends up on the municipalities. And the best way that we can do it is with these kinds of pilot projects. So why should we compost? There's many reasons. The two biggest reasons are for the environment and to save money. So for the environment, organic waste going into the landfill obviously creates the greenhouse gas methane because there's no oxygen in the landfill. By composting it, it does not release methane because there's oxygen that is able to help naturally decompose the organic material, therefore reducing your greenhouse gases and your overall carbon footprint. Compost that is used for your gardening needs is a healthier and natural option that will add needed nutrients to your soil, and it reduces the amount of leachate that is produced in the dumps, which can pollute soil and drinking water. In terms of saving money, removing organic waste from what you put to the curb will reduce the number of black bags you put out for collection. This reduction means less weight to haul for our trucks, resulting in less fuel consumption and lower fees at the dump. So it will essentially save the town money. Using compost instead of fertilizer will save you money on synthetic and chemical-based products for your lawn and flower care. So the two town initiatives are residential composters and our new community compost pilot project. The residential composters, we partnered with MMSB for the last few years. MMSB offers this program to all municipalities, and since 2005, 171 municipalities have participated, and 30,000 composters have been distributed in Newfoundland and Labrador. As a town in 2017, we purchased 40 bin-style composters, and they took us 3 years to sell. So in 2020, we changed our minds and said we wanted to purchase 40 of the tumbler style. And we were pleasantly surprised when they sold out in less than an hour. So for 2021, this year, we purchased 120 of them. And again, they sold out in about 5 hours, less than one business day. This style of composters are perfect for beginners, and they're suitable for a family or a single person. They can hold about 5 cubic feet of waste. They can be set up inside or outside and be used all year long. They're They have a dual chamber, which means you have active compost on one side and you're curing the compost on the other side. So you're basically flipping back and forth between the two, filling one and using the other. And it can produce, the manufacturers say that it can produce a usable compost in about 2 weeks. So our community composters, again, we've partnered with MMSB for their community waste diversion funding for a 1-year pilot project. We have received 4 of these large composters that you see pictured. They are good for about 30 people each, and they are able to produce a usable compost in about 6 weeks. To put that in perspective, the traditional bin style, or if you were just using a mound or that sort of thing, it usually takes about 52 weeks, a full year, for you to get a usable compost at the end. These also have a dual chamber that can be installed inside or outside. And these ones can actually hold about 16 cubic feet, or about 80 liters of compost per week. So the town, like I said, has 4 of them. The town will be installing 2 of them on town property, 1 of them at the Voisey's Brook Park and 1 of them at the Recreation Center. The one at the Recreation Center is also very close to our town hall, so town staff will be starting to compost on a regular basis. And we will be expecting anybody that uses our recreation facilities to use the kitchen catchers provided so that they can put in the compost as well. So for the other 2, we are putting out a call for interest. We are seeking expressions of interest from enthusiastic residents who would like to participate in this pilot project. Specifically, we are looking for a neighborhood or a group of people and a business to join us as stewards of one of these large community composters. For a neighborhood, we are looking for a group of up to about 30 people. So it could be a group of families, it could be a bunch of neighbors who all live next door to each other, or just people who live in close proximity who would all have easy access. They would kind of form a little committee with us and help us select a location for installation. We would need a couple of people who are going to be using it to become the stewards to help us as town staff manage it and to help us keep track of how much composting is being produced. Because at the end of the day, at the end of the 1-year project, we really want to know how much waste is being diverted. And similarly, for a business, we are looking for a business to come forward to have a bin installed on their property and become stewards of the bin. For the business to also commit to using the bin for any of their business organics. And if possible, we would like for nearby residents to be able to avail of that as well. And again, we will need to have them come on board with us to help us keep track of how much compost is being produced and how much waste is being diverted. So for both of these, the neighborhood and the business, the town commitments for this would be that we would provide the bin, we will install it, we will build a shelter around it, and we will also install signage for how to use it, what to put in, what not to put in, and we will provide information sessions and support for those people who are coming on board with us for that. We will also help with snow clearing. And for these specific composters, they're a little bit different than some of your traditional ones. You do, no matter what type of composting you're doing, you need a balance of your greens and browns. But the town will be providing the browns in the form of wood pellets for these ones because the manufacturers say that this is the best, most optimal way to get a really good, healthy compost at the end of the day. And then the compost that is created will be available to that business, those neighbors, and residents for free. If you're wondering how to get involved, you can check out the town website for updates and deadline information. Next week, we will be posting a form that people can fill out for their expression of interest. Once we get those applications will then go to a judging panel for selection. And we are currently working with the deadline of June 30th for all of this. And you can also contact me. My email address is there if you have any questions, and I'm also available on the town website as well. Thank you.
Well, that is wonderful. I know I can put a call out to our members in a newsletter, et cetera, to see if we can get them applying to help you out with this. We, of course, we have a
Wonderful.
wonderful selection of eager business owners wanting to help the community. So that should not be a problem.
I hope so. And I have infographics and information and everything that I can provide to you for all of that as well.
Excellent.